The Decatur Book Festival is not as a nonprofit. It depends on sponsors and donations to bring authors to Decatur each year. Please consider a tax-deductible donation to support the festival by going to the festival website, www.decaturbookfestival.com. Lastly, please take a moment to turn your devices off and your ringtones off for the session. Thank you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator, Keith Pepper. He is the owner and publisher of Rough Draft Atlanta, a leading local media organization. He reaches almost 1 million readers a month. Keith also serves as the board chairperson for the Atlanta Press Club. Come on in, Keith. Thank you. I will then introduce our first author, Michael Thurmond. He is the Chief Executive Officer for DeKalb County. He is the author of As you all know, he is the author of James Oglethorpe, Father of Georgia, A Founder's Journey from Slave Trader to Abolitionist. And finally, I'll introduce our second author, Paul Presley. He is the director of Ossabaw Island Education Alliance. His new book is A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida in Indian County. With that, I'll leave you to your people. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. This is quite a crowd, sitting room, standing room. Thank you guys for coming out. There are a ton of events this weekend, and the fact that you guys all chose to be here inside on a beautiful day, we really appreciate it. CEO Thurmond, Dr. Presley, thanks for being here. Before we start, because I'm a journalist, I have to ask CEO Thurmond, your term is coming to an end at the end of the year. Is there any news that you would like to break this morning about what's next?
Well, I'm working on the water bill. No, I'm just kidding. No, first, to all the wonderful people here in DeKalb County, just thank you for having given myself and Zola the opportunity to serve. I love this county. I love our people. And it has been a joy and really the privilege of my lifetime. So thank you. Thank you.
And I do want to ask you, because DeKalb County really got behind the book festival, why was it important to you personally that the book festival come back so strongly this year?
I am so thrilled. First of all, the investment that we made really began with our library director. Where's Allison? Y'all give Allison a round of applause. I know she's here. She approached me and we talked on multiple occasions, and the history, the significance of this book festival, is incalculable. I cannot tell you how important it is to have this festival, to have it renewed and rebirthed and back here in Decatur, in DeKalb County. So I want to celebrate all of the volunteers and the people who have invested over the years, and we can celebrate the fact that the Decatur Book Festival is alive, well, and growing. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank
you. And Dr. Presley, you came up from the
Please
coast.
call me Paul.
Paul came up from the coast. For those of us that, I can't ask you if you're going to run for governor. So if, for those of us that have not been to Ossabaw Island, tell us a little bit about it and why it's so important.
Well, okay, first thing I will tell you is the governor just gave me $7 million. Not me, Ossabaw Island. No, it really is. Ossabaw Island is a national treasure. It's a state heritage preserve. It's the first state heritage preserve, 1978, Governor George Busby. And it's there. It's meant not to be developed, cannot be any connection other than boat, no aircraft. And 4 or 5 ecosystems on that. So we were delighted. There is one 20,000 square foot house built by the original owners from Grosse Pointe, Michigan. And it's 20,000, 15 bedrooms, 16 bathrooms. And Mrs. West described it as their cabin in the woods. But anyway, the governor has given $7 million for the Ossabaw Island Foundation to restore it and use it for programming for the people of Georgia.
Awesome. So we all grew up in Georgia. We all went to middle school here and studied Georgia history in middle school, but we didn't study the James Oglethorpe that CEO Thurmond discovered on a trip to England. So tell us about your trip to England in 1996. What was unique about you being on that trip? And then how did that put you on this journey that went for more than a quarter century that led to your book?
Thank you. In October of 1996, I was a member of a 57-person delegation that traveled to England, led by Governor Zell Miller, to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the birth of General James Oglethorpe, the father of Georgia. On the fourth and final day of that pilgrimage, we visited the village of Cranham, which is located about 19 miles northeast of London. We visited the parish church of All Saints. General Oglethorpe and his wife, Elizabeth, are entombed beneath the floor. Near his final resting place is a white marble plaque erected on a wall that lists his life's accomplishments. Listed among that long list of accomplishments is a 8-word sentence chiseled in white marble. Preceding that, he went to Oxford. He was a great military leader, member of parliament, founder of Georgia. But these 8 words captured my attention. He was the friend of the oppressed Negro. The 56 other members were ushered after we laid the wreath to a adjacent meeting hall. And for some reason, I stayed behind, standing there in a 700-year-old church. It captured my imagination. Having been educated like many of you in Georgia, I knew about the James Oglethorpe that founded Georgia, that was concerned about impoverished British subjects. But in all of my studies, even as a lawyer and even my own research, I never heard the father of Georgia described as a friend of the oppressed Negro. He died in 1785 at a point in time when Black people, legally and through custom, were determined to be property and subhuman. This man, James Oglethorpe, founded our state, stood out. Now, I thought it was a lie. Right? Or just the meanderings of a bereaved widow. It's like going to a funeral and they're doing all the eulogies. Like, am I at the right funeral? And so I set out, Keith, to basically find evidence to refute it and to expose it as a 300-year-old lie. Because if I was looking for a friend of the oppressed Negro in 1785, the last place I would look would be the state of Georgia. But anyway.
So we'll come back to find out if it is true. Stay, nobody leave. So I'm going to try and weave together timelines. I hope there's no history teachers in the crowd to keep me honest. But Paul, you discovered a story that also wasn't the common narrative told and taught in middle school. You've been a lifelong educator, the son of a principal, and then later the headmaster at a school. So how did you find the story of the Underground Railroad that was going south, not the one that we all studied that was going north?
When I retired from my school, I became the education director of the Ossabaw Island Education Alliance. And that's sponsored by the Board of Regents, which paid my salary in the Department of Natural Resources, and the Ossabaw Island Foundation. And I did a symposium, and we put on a symposium and did a book that called African American Life in the Georgia Lowcountry, which Michael Thurmond has used and appreciated and has in his bibliography, which we appreciate that. I discovered that some of the enslaved people on Ossabaw made it to Spanish Florida. And that intrigued me, because how many of us in Georgia history even Think about Spanish Florida. Georgia had a common border with Spanish Florida for almost 70 years. And I found a man named Titus, and Titus led over a 12-year period 28 enslaved people to Spanish Florida. He crossed international boundaries 3 times. He created 3 different communities, 1 in Florida and 2 in Georgia. So I said, something is going on. And as I did my more research elsewhere, found hundreds and hundreds of people made it to Spanish Florida. But that meant Spanish Florida. It meant the Seminoles, where they became black Seminoles, or they became Maroons. And I'll stop right there.
So tell us more about the role in Spanish Florida, because the role the Catholic Church played in the assimilation of the people that were leaving Georgia, the slaves that were leaving Georgia, coming there.
Well, Michael Thurmond really mentions this in his book, because before the Revolution, the Spanish in Florida were sort of at a disadvantage to the Carolinians, much less in the way of population. So what they found is fugitive enslaved people popping up in St. Augustine were offered freedom on one condition, that they converted to Catholicism. That was the key. And believe you me, there was a lot of conversions that went on. and after the Spanish came back to Florida, after the American Revolution, they reinstituted the policy of sanctuary in return for Catholicism. And in fact, I will add, most of the fugitives that came across the border decided not to convert to Catholicism, and they disappeared and became Maroons or joined the Seminoles.
So the theme of change in both of your books and both in the research, but CEO Thurmond, you talk about your thinking of Oglethorpe had to change, and you talk about a subtext of change. He had to change himself, and therefore he changed history. So, what about that theme of change did you discover?
And following up on what Paul is saying, one of the rationale, one of the reasons for the founding of the Georgia colony was to prohibit the number of enslaved blacks who were escaping, fleeing from South Carolina to Florida. See, the American history, particularly Black American history, the cornerstone of that is the North Star. You follow where? The North Star to freedom. What Paul is referencing, what I talked about, was actually for nearly a century, the Underground Railroad ran south, not north. We studied Sojourner Truth as we should, and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and the Crafts. They were scores, hundreds. What he mentioned, I want to reiterate it, thousands successfully escaped south. But we hear little or nothing about it. And before you reach Spanish Florida, he mentioned it, and I want to go back to it. That was another nation that offered freedom and sanctuary. And those were the Seminoles. The Seminoles were a fully integrated tribe of Black and Native people. Now, the African Americans in the audience, what the grandmama always told you, what kind of blood? Maybe it was just my grandma, but they all said it, right? And the Seminoles were never defeated on the fields of battle. They fought 3 major wars against what was the colonial forces and the United States, including Andrew Jackson. Were never defeated, signed a peace treaty, and relocated to Oklahoma. So James Oglethorpe was a politician, right? And part of what he did for rationale was to suggest to those South Carolina slave owners that if you created a colony where slavery was prohibited, that would discourage enslaved blacks from escaping from South Carolina to Florida, because you would have an all-white population and it would be more difficult to make that treacherous journey. But James Oglethorpe, when I introduced him as an adult, by the way, is not this. Ultimately, he becomes, I believe, among, if not the first white man in North America to oppose chattel slavery. James Oglethorpe. But when you meet him, he is the deputy governor, the number 2 guy in the principal slave trading British firm, the Royal African Company. So the book is about his journey from being a slave trader to becoming an abolitionist. And that is the point. Sometimes, folks, if you can change yourself, you can ultimately change the course of world history.
And what was it that set him on that path? There was a letter. Talk about what set him on that path to change.
Well, the triggering event, I believe, in his life was a letter fell into his possession, and the letter had been written by an enslaved young black man who was enslaved in the colony of Maryland. He had been captured on the Gambian coast, transported, and enslaved on a tobacco plantation. Somehow he convinced his enslaver to allow him to write a letter to his father back in Africa, acquainting him of his current state of affairs. I'll stop. Now, what's interesting about that? He did what? He could write. Joe Barry Carroll is over here. Y'all give Joe Barry Carroll a round of applause. I love this guy. I'm in because Joe Barry Carroll example of supporting this book festival and books and literacy was my North Star. But this letter that this young man wrote, see, we don't know, Joe knows this, that some of the first universities, the first libraries were established on the west coast of Africa. Before Oxford, before Harvard. He was literate. He wrote a letter. The letter was transported 4,000 miles from Maryland back to London. Think about it. No FedEx. Right? No UPS. Thank God he didn't put it in the U.S. Postal Service. But, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's just, Oglethorpe, the letter falls into his possession primarily because he worked for a slave trading firm. But the letter was written in Arabic. The young man was a Muslim. He sends it to Oxford. It's translated, and the contents are so affecting that Oglethorpe arranged to have the young man transported from Maryland. He pays for passage and ultimately promises to pay for his freedom. The young man actually arrives in London and becomes a roaring lion of British society, and ultimately had a meeting with the King and Queen of England. I'll stop.
So let's on the theme of borders and crossing borders, Paul, you have some thoughts around this and how the establishment of Spanish Florida and its relationship to Georgia in that time.
Let me just mention this because this is very interesting, because chapter 2 of my book is about Mohammed. And Mohammed comes from the Gambia River. And we know where he actually came from the Bambari people in what is now Mali today. And he is bought and sold, transported to the Savannah River on a rice plantation. And he ends up 16 miles above Savannah on something called Bear Creek Island. And there about 100 Maroons formed in the 1780s. And the key people were 12 Africans who fought for the British during the Revolution. 1787, the Georgia State Militia, the South Carolina State Militia, and 20 Catawba Indians invaded that island to break up that Maroon community, and Mohammed died fighting. So, when you draw this trail across it, the determination, the risk-taking of these people is incredible. There's a certain personality of these individuals. And of course, that's what happened when you transfer going to Spanish Florida. These are enormous risk takers. And they didn't travel one or two at a time. They traveled in groups because they were in boats. They knew how to sail. These were saltwater people.
And this area of Georgia is now still in the news today as a point. What's happening in the community down in Savannah now with in this area? Can you Can you talk a little bit about that?
Keep going.
I mean, I'm following a little bit of it through the current, actually, through Margaret's reporting. But
okay, well, there's a lot
I'll
going
quickly
on.
be out of my depth.
On Sapelo.
Sapelo Island.
On Sapelo, oh yeah. Well, the fight continues. One of the things that people have thought about the Gullah Geechee people, and I've had a really wonderful experience of being around. You try to understand and appreciate and see and absorb a little bit, is that they have the West African retentions, Gullah, speaking Gullah, their diet, their dance, and so this. Historians have considered them passive and submissive. They were not. They was resistant. They resisted slavery in so many ways. And what's going on Sapelo right now, you see that resistance to seeing their land, Hog Hammock, and others being taken, McIntosh County commissioners raising the tax rates and pretty much pricing them out of their land holdings.
Yeah. The last case I represented, Mary Margaret, before I became school superintendent, I represented the residents at Hog Hammock on Sapelo Island. And at that point, they were trying to increase the land values, the assessed values of their property, primarily to drive them out and force them to sell their property. It's a 1-hour ferry ride from the coast to Hog Hammock or Sapelo, but it's a 200-year journey. It's a 200-year journey back in past. One of the things that Paul referenced it, I want you, when we think about American slavery and enslaved people working, where do you picture them working? In a what? Cotton field. Actually, Georgia, South Carolina, those plantations in the early colonial time wasn't cotton. Cotton, the GM was 1793. It was rice. They're rice plantations, right? And it was called the Golden Seed. The Gullah Geechee were actually highly prized enslaved people from the west coast of Africa because they had cultivated rice for close to 3 millennia. And they were prized because they had the brains and the brawn and the expertise to create rice culverts, dams, all you have to do freshwater rice. But these plantations were isolated. Whites couldn't really live on the plantation because of disease and because of the heat. So they were isolated. That's why they were able to retain their culture. So the descendants of the first rice goers are the Gullah Geechee that we have today. Is that fair, Paul?
That is a wonderful assessment. I'm taking notes.
What's the plantation? What's the plantation?
Hawful Plantation, which is open to the public, and you can see this. South Carolina has probably done a better job than Georgia has. My thing when I first came, I realized in 2005, South Carolina has eaten Georgia's lunch. We have not done what we should do in telling the story of the Gullah Geechee on the coast of Georgia. And I think what Michael and I are trying to do is to bring this back. There's so much there. The Gullah are not passive. There was a famous situation, I'm sure some of you called Ebo Landing. And this is 1803 when the ship Mary came and brought over 300 enslaved people smuggled in. And they were sold and sent. 20 of them or 25 were sent to St. Simon's. And there was a revolt on this boat, on this vessel. They killed the 3 crew members, the white crew members. And the incredible thing, instead of jumping off and going on to St. Simon's, they chose to march into the marsh and drown themselves. At least that's the story, and it may be true. And it's just been a huge theme. But Ebo Landing, Toni Morrison has put that into Beloved. I mean, it's just a huge theme. And one of the things I'm working on is an article about the slave traders who brought the ship Mary there and dispersed these people on the coast, and see where we go with that.
And if I may add, one of the things that made Oglethorpe unique, Keith, you asked, he recognized, it's called agency. And it wasn't just the Gullah Geechee. Enslaved Africans were much more aggressive in resisting enslavement than is generally portrayed in American history. You may have heard of Nat Turner's rebellion. That was just a tip of the iceberg, right? So what Oglethorpe warned those who wanted to export slavery into Georgia is that the blacks would resist and they would fight for their freedom. And one of the things that's so important that we talk about anti-slavery, and this is getting ready, news flash. I'm getting ready to make some news. That one thing, all white people did not support slavery. James Oglethorpe, the Darien Scots, and the Lutheran, the Germans at Ebenezer, all opposed slavery because it thought it was horrific and ungodly and immoral, and spoke very eloquently about it. One of the most outspoken anti-slavery advocates other than James Oglethorpe was a young evangelist named John Wesley. Any Methodists? Where my Methodists? All right, John Wesley spoke very aggressively. And so what the book really talks about is the agency of black people resisting, because during the Revolutionary War, blacks in Georgia fought with the British because the British offered freedom when the patriots would not. But the book is about an alliance between anti-slavery blacks and whites and Native Indians.
What's the difference in being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery?
Great question. That's the crux of my book. You could be anti-slavery, but not yet for abolition. Because abolition, anti-slavery, I think is wrong, it's immoral, it's ungodly. Abolition says, and enslaved blacks should be free and offered or provided the same rights as whites. We're still having this argument, aren't we? We really are. And so James Oglethorpe was anti-slavery before he became an abolitionist. And part of that journey was through religion and John Wesley. Wesley was unique. What made him unique was that he felt, contrary to the prevailing Christian view, black people had redeemable souls. The narrative was that if you were a beast, subhuman, you could not possess a soul. And the prevailing view of white Christians were that blacks could not possess a soul. Even worse, in terms of the enslavers or people who supported slavery, not only did blacks have souls, even though they were enslaved, that those who embraced Christianity would have equal access to the kingdom of God. That a white soul and a black soul would have to stand equal before the throne of grace. John Wesley wasn't that popular.
But James,
What you thinking, Joe?
but Oglethorpe was, you describe him as a humanist, and he was progressive with Jews, with women. So talk more about that, and then where that put him in society. And then I want to try and tie things to modern day. So just to plant this, and you can think about it, is who would he be today? What would he see? What would he make of our current political discourse?
They would wear him out on Fox News. I'm just telling you, they would just wear him out every day. But no, well, first, he saw enslaved blacks and black people as part of the human family, but he also considered Native Indians, Tamachichi, who we may have heard about as a member of the human family, who he also assisted in visiting England. Contrary to the law that prohibited the migration of Jews to Georgia, he allowed Jews to migrate to Georgia. The oldest Jewish synagogue in the South, the third oldest in America, is there in Savannah, right? And when he returned to England, he was one of the few British elites who supported the right of women to pursue intellectual objectives through education and enlightenment. He supported a group of women called the Blue Stockings, which you all maybe is a great book out about the Blue Stockings. And one of them was Hannah More, who was one of the first feminist writers, who wrote the poem of slavery to commemorate the first debate on slavery in the British Parliament. So, and I'll start with this. He founded Georgia in 1733. England did not prohibit slavery until 1833. He was literally, from a historical chronological perspective, 100 years ahead of his time. And America not to 1863.
And Paul, similarly tying what you've uncovered in your research and in your book to modern day Black, what we've seen with Black Lives Matter, what we've seen in modern day society, and how you draw parallels there.
Well, let me jump in one thing, taking it a little different direction, and that's about Maroons, because they have recently been discovered by historians, and it was thought that there were no Maroons in North America. And what is a Maroon? It was thought that they were in the Caribbean and in South America, and these were Africans who enslaved people, who fled into the mountains, who fled into the swamps, who hid, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with white people. They wanted autonomy. They wanted self-determination. They wanted self-government. And all of a sudden, historians are now beginning to look at the United States and discovering that they were very much present here. And again, part of my study is detailing some of these Maroons who went to Spanish Florida and set up Maroon communities, one of whom came back and set up a Maroon community. It's very important to understand the whole range of opinion. And of course, when I think about that today, Keith, I think of the Black Panthers or people who really sort of out there, but you have to admire what they were doing. To me, the Black Lives Matter movement is very much like fleeing to Spanish Florida. You are trying to be assimilated as a human being and treated that. This is one thing, though, Spanish law treated Africans as legal personalities. It was possible for a slave to sue a master in a court of law. That's what these people were trying to do, and that's what we see happening today. They're trying to be treated as a human being and transformed in that way.
So James Oglethorpe he was forced out of Georgia. So what, without giving away the whole book, what happened where he was eventually forced out in disgrace?
Well, if you take unpopular positions, bad things happen to you. They really do. James Oglethorpe was basically run out of Georgia in disgrace. He sailed in 1743, July. He sailed back to England to face trial for 19 charges, one of them being treason, which, if convicted, could be punishable by death. He potentially faced financial ruin because Parliament would not reimburse him for major investments he made to finance the Georgia colony, primarily because the slave owners and those who supported slavery in South Carolina and in Georgia had initiated a smear campaign, like negative ads on TV, right? That's what that is, right? And so he ultimately was exonerated, though, and he continued his life. But I guess the key point, though, and I want to emphasize this, Oglethorpe died believing that his idea of a slave-free Zion in the wilderness had failed. History basically teaches us that he had this overly progressive liberal idea that you could actually have a society that prohibited the enslavement of people and still prosper. What I want to share to you all is that James Oglethorpe did not fail. We live in a slave-free Georgia. His vision became the reality that we are today. Those who oppose him have been relegated to the dustbins of history. And we need to celebrate James Oglethorpe for having the courage to stand up. What he taught us is don't be a bystander to your own life. Have the courage to stand up for what's right. And that's who and what James Oglethorpe represented to me.
So I want to peel back to look at the process of writing, because we may have some budding writers and people in the room, and you guys, I mean, this is an amazing event and packed room, but I know you don't do this for the bestsellers and you know, being in a relatively small press. What, I'll come to you in a second, because I'm just amazed at how you find the time to do this. But you know, Paul, the same. I mean, what, you know, I learned how you found the story, but then what drives you to do this?
Why in the world would anybody in their right mind attempt to write a book about people who've left no records? And it's what historians now call archival silence. I mean, that is an official term. Archival silence.
Speaking to my
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgot about that part. You know, what makes somebody write a book in which there is very few records? Archival silence. It's a jigsaw puzzle, and you have thousands of pieces, and you have to have incredible patience, and you have to love archives in 18th century dust. But you can piece it together. And the main thing is you're not just trying to assemble a timeline where they did this and they did that, and you can do that. You feel pretty good about it. But how do you create the human being and the hopes and the aspirations and the fears and the frustrations and the failures? That's what made writing this book so satisfying. And I think with Mohammed and Titus and Nancy and Betty and Hercules, I did succeed with them and putting them in that general context to understand why they were doing and why it was important. Black resistance existed, and you got to appreciate who these people were inside, not just outside.
And so do you see where do you see this book fitting in? I mean, you're an educator. Where does it fit in schools, and what do you want people to take? What do you want this audience to take and go tell their kids and grandkids?
Well, the basic thing is, when you write a book like this, you want to change the telling of history. You're not just writing this to tell a good story. You're writing to change history. That's what Michael is doing. He's changing the writing of history. I am sure because of that book, you will see this. And I want my book on Black resistance in the Southeast and the fact that freedom was found outside the borders of the United States. It was not found in Jefferson's Empire of Liberty. We need to think about this. We need to think about the fact that the history of Georgia spills over into the Caribbean. We can't be so insular as to be comfortable with just our own borders. But will that happen? I don't know. Glacial pace.
And where does this? Well, first of all, how do you find the time to do this book? Wait, when do you sleep?
Well, not a lot happens in DeCap, so it just kind of, nothing goes on.
That's why you have Rockdale for things that happen there.
Yeah. That's why I was in Augusta yesterday, but no, and I tell Zola, my daughter, this is my life's work. This is the thing I'll be remembered for. People will forget the CEO stuff. It just will. That's just the way it is. Or that we were in the legislature together, Mayor Mark. The closest human beings come to creating something that's not so much immortal, but that will stand the test of time, is the written word. That's why this festival is so important for those who are writing or will write. And it doesn't have to be a book. And I've said this, is write your children or your grandchildren a letter. One of my favorite possessions is a 3-sentence letter my late mother wrote me when I was a freshman at Payne College. And she sent me $5. And she said, I love you. And anytime I'm having a bad day, my mom is there to say, I love you. It's immortal. This book, and I think something happened that afternoon on October 7, 1996. I'm standing there, and I think, and I may not be, I felt like I was the first Black Georgian ever to visit Oglethorpe's grave. And reading the plaque is like he was saying to me, I'm your friend. And so I believe that we Georgians, we're better than who we think we are. If James Oglethorpe is our father, then we are his direct descendants. We're not descended directly from the three guys carved on the mountain in Car. It's not Jefferson and it's not Jackson. It's Oglethorpe.
None of whom were Georgians. Right?
None of whom was Georgian. James Oglethorpe wanted us to be a place that embraced people, regardless of race or religion, and let's come forward, sexual orientation, a place for a second chance. He founded Georgia, by the way, because he was concerned about overcrowded prisons and people who were homeless sleeping on the streets of London. So the next time you see a homeless person in the cab, think James Oglethorpe, who saw not wasted, but opportunity in giving people a second chance for a life for themselves and their families. So that's why I wrote. And sometimes if you're a writer, you have to take advantages of the opportunity. But for the pandemic, I would never finish the book. I had 3 years. And something Paul said is the primary sources. The great news now, Keith, they're digitized. We're in a different world now. Those newspapers that I used to walk to the end of the driveway to get, I canceled my subscription. Right?
Killing me.
You are the future. You are the future. He had Rough Draft. It's amazing. Y'all familiar with Rough Draft? Raise your hand if you know Rough Draft. You got to read it. He has great writers. It's virtual, it's digitized. It is where we are going. I'm just telling you. And so those archival documents are now at your disposal. And that's the pandemic and that fact are the reasons I was able to complete the book.
Well, I think we are documenting modern history. We're doing the rough draft or the first draft of history, but what you guys did in uncovering, I grew up in Georgia. I left for over 20 years and I've come back and I've just been really gripped by the changes in Atlanta, but also just the differences in the state. I never had been to many parts of the state, and meeting folks and digging into what you guys did is just really helped me uncover a really amazing place. So I hope that you guys will get the books. The authors are going to be outside signing and selling books with local booksellers. So please support them. Thank you for coming to
Keith. May I just say one quick thing? I know.
Please.
I just want to thank Michael Thurmond. It's been 3 or 4 years that we've been following each other. I've never seen something like this. I can text him a message about how's your book coming, and within about 10 minutes, I get a reply. I just have it's really encouraging along the way. I'm just so appreciative. I sit on the advisory council for UGA Press, and I will tell you, his book is already a bestseller.
Well, thank you to Paul. His book and his research played a huge role in creating the intellectual foundation for what I was able to do. You always build on the shoulders of other great scholars and researchers, and Paul Presley is one of those people who has continued to bring new focus and attention to the rich history of our state. Thank you, Paul.